The transgender craze is growing and metastasizing in America and worldwide. Confusion is abounding. On Season 2 of Generation Indoctrination, we're bringing you the powerful audio version of the new ebook, Exposing the Gender Lie, How to Protect Children and Teens from the Transgender Industry's False Ideology. In the book, Summit Ministries President Dr. Jeff Myers and Christian Post reporter Brandon Showalter explore the diabolical nature of the movement and how to stop this ideology from continuing to wreak havoc. This is Chapter 2.
Chapter 2. The History and Trajectory of Gender Ideology. Quote, "What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun." Unquote. Ecclesiastes 1:9. A few years ago, the phrase rapid onset gender dysphoria, ROGD, emerged in an attempt to explain the abrupt emergence of tens of thousands of gender-confused children who were suddenly questioning their sexual identity. In 2018, public health researcher Lisa Lippman published a peer-reviewed article in PLOS ONE, an academic journal examining the phenomenon. Her findings revealed that 65% of young girls who had self-identified as transgender during their adolescence did so after being immersed in social media for extended periods of time. In other words, the sharp increase of cases in dysphoria was not a naturally occurring phenomenon, but an internet-fueled peer contagion. Rapid onset is a phrase that accurately describes how people feel about the gender ideology movement in general. They ask, where did this come from all of a sudden? Well, it did not arise all of a sudden. An old adage says, what is taught in the classroom in one generation will be believed and practiced in government and society in the next generation. This is the case with gender ideology, which spread unnoticed in academic circles for decades before surfacing in recent years as a seemingly overwhelming force, riding shotgun and occasionally taking the wheel as the novelty of gender-bending popular culture swerved its way into the American consciousness. As a graduate student, one of the authors of this book was assigned a scholarly written article in the late 80s entitled Doing Gender. It argued that gender was not a biological state but a, quote, routine accomplishment embedded in everyday interaction, unquote. Saturated in pseudo-academic jargon, the article posited that gender does not refer to essential traits, but rather performances based on how people present themselves and are viewed by others. This was 3 decades before the writing of the book you are reading right now. Doing Gender, in turn, was based on a theory that was articulated by Irving Goffman in the 1950s. Goffman's social interaction theory advanced the notion that when people interact with one another, they play roles based on what they think is expected of them. These roles are based on what people do, not on what they are. Goffman's work set in motion what is now a given in academic circles, that we humans are basically a set of social constructions based on our experiences and interactions. A person is not a husband or wife in a particular sense, but just a person who acts as he or she thinks that other people think a husband or wife should act. Similarly, the Doing Gender article asserted that categories of male and female are relevant only in that we present ourselves as we think male and female ought to be presented, based on the stereotypes we unconsciously accept. Without this theoretical uncoupling of sex and gender, gender ideology makes no sense. With it, no other view makes sense. This is why, if you find yourself interacting with people who embrace gender ideology, you might get the distinct impression that they see you as bad, not just wrong. The very idea of what it means to be human shifted long ago in academia, and most people did not notice until it came to the public's attention in the form of biological males wanting to compete on women's sports teams or use women's restrooms. Ideas have consequences, but often, by the time we realize that those consequences are under sail, the ship is already halfway across the ocean. To understand gender ideology, we cannot just look back to the radical scholars from the 1980s. We need to look all the way back to ancient Greece, and then look forward to the implications of today's ideas of queer theory and even transhumanism. When it comes to gender ideology, even radical professors at taxpayer-funded universities have a tradition to draw on, one that can be traced to ancient history. As can be seen in many of Plato's dialogues, it was common among Greek men to prefer effeminate boys to women. Older, powerful men publicly preyed on vulnerable young men who were of lesser status. Often, submitting to this abuse was seen by young men as necessary for social advancement. Evidence of this phenomenon may be found in the New Testament books of the Bible that are letters composed by the Apostle Paul to the church in Corinth. Corinth was famous in ancient Greece for its sexual immorality, a reputation that continued into the time that the Apostle Paul planted a church there. This seems to be the context of Paul's comments in 1 Corinthians 11:14, where he says, quote, "Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him?" Unquote. While there is nothing inherently wrong with men having longer hair or women having shorter hair, the context makes clear that Paul saw it as obvious that it is inappropriate for men to pretend to be the opposite sex for a manifestly sinful purpose. Of course, in the contemporary West, hairstyles are relatively neutral morally, but the underlying principles of identity remain the same. In the modern West, many of the premises of the sexual revolution have become firmly ensconced in the culture, particularly as it relates to human nature. These assumptions about sexual ethics are increasingly pagan, meaning that the Judeo-Christian principles are rejected as backward and oppressive. Biblically Orthodox Christians have historically held and continue to espouse that God created sex as fundamentally good, procreative, and designed to be enjoyed between a married man and woman. Any sexual practice outside of that vision is not in accordance with the biblically rooted sexual ethic. Christians have not historically categorized sexual identity in psychological terms. What then for those individuals who genuinely experience same-sex attraction or an incongruence with their biological sex? As a way of describing this real phenomenon, the category sexual orientation has emerged, based on a psychologized concept of the self. This is a truly radical shift in how human beings have come to understand who they are. As Carl Trueman notes in The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, one cannot escape this revolutionary creed from sitcoms to the halls of Congress that, quote, is as much of a symptom and a cause of the many social, ethical, and political questions we now face, unquote. This revolution has radically altered how people in Western societies have come to understand the very idea of the self. The self has now replaced truth. To the cult of self, our bodies are not intertwined with our souls in a purposeful way, but are mere blobs of matter with no transcendent meaning, except that which serves our desirable personal ends. Sexuality, then, is reduced to our purpose for it. Stripped of its holy vocation, sexuality increasingly becomes, as Pope John Paul II observed in his 1995 encyclical, Evangelium Vitae, quote, the occasion and instrument for self-assertion and the selfish satisfaction of personal desires and instincts, unquote. Yet gender identity is, we would argue, many steps beyond even sexual orientation as a category of selfhood. If someone tells you that they are gay or lesbian, or for that matter, that they are a heterosexual, there is little doubt as to what that person means. They are telling you how and toward what kind of people they experience sexual attraction. Whatever one might think of specific sexual practices or same-sex relationships, the nature of what is being said is not in dispute. By contrast, when someone speaks of possessing a gender identity, there is no similar understanding about what that is. Indeed, gender identity categories proceed from the premise that gender is, by definition, uncoupled from the material reality of biological sex. At root, this is not a recognition of the complicated aspects of sexual attraction as much as it is a fundamental reinterpretation of what it means to be human. Some who identify as transsexual, transgender, or as some other gender identity might be honest about their natal sex. They may be genuinely distressed about their confusion. The psychological anguish that comes with such a body dysmorphia may be severe and painful. But the problem is, with the enshrinement of gender identity as the only way we can make sense of our biological sex, we lose the ability to root our understanding of maleness and femaleness in anything other than cultural stereotypes. Further, such thinking makes it extraordinarily difficult for societies to develop sensible policies that protect political and human rights that are based on sex. Gender identity theory dissociates sexuality from anything that can be rooted in material reality. With the advance of gender ideology, the instrumentalization of the body, aided along by pharmaceuticals, surgical scalpels, and endless identity qualifiers, has established itself in the modern mind in a way that would have been unimaginable just a few decades ago. The internet has brought the gender identity revolution to the masses with great fanfare and profit for its social media purveyors. Abigail Favale, who was a gender studies professor and avowed postmodernist before her conversion to Catholicism, states in her book, The Genesis of Gender, A Christian Theory, that the access of children to the internet plays a central role in the advance of transgenderism. Americans strongly agree with this sentiment. In a recent poll jointly conducted by Summit Ministries and the respected polling company the McLaughlin Group, 69% of voters who have an opinion on the issue say that the increase in transgenderism among underage minors is the result of them being influenced to question their gender due to social media and other cultural influences. While gender confusion is not anything new in a moral sense, the widespread internet-fueled peer contagion and the accompanying media glamorization of gender identities entices vulnerable youth and young adults into its entanglements in hopes that it will give them a meaningful identity in a post-truth society. The social infrastructure of an adolescent's life, their dependence on social media or peer interactions, can easily trump the influence of their family of origin, shaping their conception of the self and making it startlingly easy for transgender activists to prey on them. This new thinking about transgenderism rests in a pseudo-academic discipline called queer theory. Those who further this theory write in nearly incomprehensible jargon, as this quote from the prominent queer theorist Judith Butler, a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, illustrates, quote, that the power regimes of heterosexism and phallogocentrism seek to augment themselves through a constant repetition of their logic, their metaphysic, and their naturalized ontologies does not imply that repetition itself ought to be stopped, as if it could be. If repetition is bound to persist as the mechanism of the cultural reproduction of identities, then the crucial question emerges. What kind of subversive repetition might call into question the regulatory practice of identity itself? Unquote. Widely considered, the founding document of queer theory is an essay called Thinking Sex by Gail Rubin, an anthropology professor at the University of Michigan. The essay is fraught with troubling assertions about human sexuality that attempt to deconstruct sex negativity, by which Rubin means a Judeo-Christian moral framework of sexual ethics that prizes marriage, love, and childbearing. As Rubin sees it, the charmed circle of Judeo-Christian sexual ethics is oppressive to those who wish to experience sexual pleasure alone, in groups, with children, or with manufactured objects. An integral part of queer theory is the deconstruction of the sex binary. As we will discuss in the forthcoming chapter on language, gender ideology theorists seek to disrupt the relationship between sex and gender, presenting sex as a biological construct and gender as a social one. To be sure, there is a social aspect to the way maleness and femaleness are presented in any given society. In the United States, blue is considered the color of boys and pink the color of girls. But this is not hardwired into our biology. It is a cultural artifact. Other colors like green and orange do not have any gendered meaning ascribed to them. But queer theorists go beyond whatever gender might mean as it is expressed in a culture and posit that biological sex, too, is socially constructed. Transgender, then, is a term describing a fluid sexual identity where a person claims to have been born in the wrong body. This gives rise to so many categories of sexual identity that it is hard to keep track of them all. 2 decades ago, people spoke of heterosexual and homosexual and divided all homosexual into gay or lesbian depending on whether a person was male or female. We mentioned earlier that the latest we've seen lists 68 gender identities. The acronym LGBTQ is no longer sufficient. As of this writing, the latest acronym to encapsulate various sexual identities is LGBTQQIP2SAA. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, pansexual, two-spirit, androgynous, and asexual. It is important to note that Christians are far from the only ones who express doubts about contemporary gender ideology. Radical feminists have long contended that the current gender ideology dogma is, among other things, a set of regressive sex stereotypes. 3 such writers are Sheila Jeffries, author of Gender Hurts, a feminist analysis of transgenderism, Janice Raymond, who wrote a prophetic book called The Transsexual Empire, The Making of the She-Male, and Kara Dansky, who published The Abolition of Sex, How the Transgender Agenda Harms Women and Girls in 2021. In each society, certain gender roles of masculinity and femininity tend to arise from the biological differences between male and female. These differ by culture and often vary based on the level of economic development and the divisions of labor within a people group. These gender roles are not strict, hard and fast rules. Yet transgenderism assumes that these roles are absolute and rigidly enshrines them. Many trans-identified men who call themselves female or transsexual will dress extravagantly in skirts and dresses and wear makeup and claim that those things are part of what makes them female. But there is nothing intrinsically female about wearing makeup and dresses and other garments often worn by females. These are stereotypes and customs. Indeed, it is an affront to women to reduce them to such cultural stereotypes. This is among the core objections of feminists who are writing in opposition to gender ideology. Gender ideology functions as a boundary breaker. Dissociation from sexed bodies is not a one-time act. It is a process with no end in sight. Though it seems freakishly outrageous, transhumanism is an example of where things are headed. Transhumanism, like the ancient Gnostic heresy that says that our bodies have nothing to do with who we are, promises not only freedom in a new self or identity, but also a form of immortality. According to Fabrice Jodarand, a professor of Swiss nationality who teaches at a Wisconsin medical school and is a renowned scholar in neuroethics, transhumanism posits, quote, that the body is totally irrelevant to our identity as a human being, unquote, and that, quote, the body becomes something you can manipulate at will and doesn't have any normative stand in defining who we are as human beings, unquote. It is thus no coincidence that one of the most visible transgender-identified people, Martine Rothblatt, is also a leader in transhumanism. Rothblatt, a 68-year-old male who has undergone surgery to amputate his genitals, is a multimillionaire who appeared on the cover of New York Magazine alongside the headline, The Trans Everything CEO, in September of 2014, which referred to Rothblatt as the, quote, highest paid female executive in America, unquote. Rothblatt's immense wealth came from Sirius Satellite Radio and United Therapeutics, a biopharmaceutical firm based in Silver Spring, Maryland. In addition to being a trans activist, Rothblatt founded a futuristic transhumanist tech called Terrasem in 2002. The Terrasem Beliefs page states, quote, nobody dies so long as enough information about them is preserved. They are simply in a state of cybernetic biostasis. Future mind-aware technology will enable them to be revived, if desired, to healthy and independent living, unquote. The movement even co-opts God, claiming that, quote, we are making God as we are implementing technology that is ever more all-knowing, ever-present, all-powerful, and beneficent. Geoethical nanotechnology will ultimately connect all consciousness and control the cosmos, unquote. Rothblatt even designed a robotic clone of Bina 48, Rothblatt's Spice, which is the term Rothblatt prefers to spouse, whose appearance looks like the real Bina Rothblatt and has received many uploads of information from the real Bina's life, presumably so Bina can live forever in cyberspace. It seems outlandish to think that this is where we are headed. But a mere 20 years ago, it would have seemed outlandish that a child would be given high-powered and untested hormonal agents to arrest natural puberty in pursuit of a physiological impossibility, that of becoming the opposite sex. Yet here we are. As explained in the previous chapter, such procedures are routinely practiced in children's hospitals nationwide. It remains to be seen whether those of a Judeo-Christian heritage will be able to discern the times and effectively advance a biblical concept of both body and soul that accounts for biological reality and also the need for human flourishing in such confusing times. Bad ideas die a slow death unless some kind of renewal or revival displaces them. What will we do? We need to know, because reality itself is at stake.
Thank you for listening. Go over to the show notes to see how you can download Exposing the Gender Lie, How to Protect Children and Teens from the Transgender Industry's False Ideology ebook free from the Christian Post. And be sure to find out more about Dr. Jeff Myers and Summit Ministries at summit.org.